Hello everyone and welcome to this video of the series Simplified Openings, Practical Solutions to Opening Problems. In this video, we will start with a story. And the story begins with a problem. The problem being what to play against the Caro-Kann. So, the story begins at the Four Nations Chess League. I was playing against an opponent who was playing the Caro-Kann. And I was preparing, and to be honest, I wasn't quite happy with any of the lines I have looked at, and believe me, I have looked at practically at all the lines against the Caro-Kann. And eventually I settled on the King's Indian attack. So I intended to play e4, c6, d3, d5, knight d2, e5, knight f3, bishop d6, and now I was struggling whether to go with d4 or g3. And as I was checking my analysis, my previous preparation of these lines, I wasn't too happy about them, and I had my engine running at the same time. So I was going forward, backwards with the moves, trying to memorize, but not entirely happy, and I felt that something wasn't quite right. I mean, none of these options were too pleasing. And as I was looking at the lines and the engine running, keep that in mind, I came back and I was going back, and then I came back even as early as move 3. And at this exact position, I think a message arrived on my phone or something like that. So I picked up the phone and I was checking what's going on. It was probably some message I was replying or what was... it's not that important. But what happened was that as I left the phone and I turned my look towards the screen, where again I will repeat, the engine was running, I looked at the proposed moves by the engine, and somewhere around move 3 or 4, best moves of the engine, I was like, what? I couldn't believe my eyes. The engine was actually proposing that move. So, okay. I checked the time. I have 20 minutes till the start of the game. So now another difficult decision. Do I stick to my preparation knight d2 and everything that I've looked at, but not being entirely happy with it? Or do I try to cover as much ground as I can with the move I'm looking at the screen and the engine proposes, and try to surprise my opponent? I quickly made the decision for the latter. So, time to disclose the move, bishop f4. Now, for those of you who have played the Caro-Kann with white and maybe have looked at these d3 lines, you know that knight d2 is the main move, and a very popular alternative recently is the move knight f3. And in fact, the move bishop f4 is very similar in spirit to the move knight f3, but much less popular than knight f3. The idea of both knight f3 and bishop f4 is to stop e5 by controlling that square. It's very simple and straightforward. Both moves allow black to capture on e4 and exchange queens, and where we will reach an endgame. So this line is definitely for those of you who don't mind playing that symmetrical endgame. It's symmetrical, yes. It's equal, yes, but it's not dead. And I will show you some ideas in the endgame. So what happened in the game is that it was funny that I played bishop f4 and my opponent was visibly shocked and started to spend masses of time, and all credit goes to him. He played a really good game, where I had one chance to obtain an advantage, after which he didn't give me any chances and the game ended in a draw. We will take a look at how this game proceeded. So this is the shortcut solution to the Caro-Kann, bishop f4. And I'll show you some lines and see if you like them. Obviously, black has a wide choice here. But still, the critical moves, I would say, are the endgame after de4 and also the move queen b6, which we will look at shortly. Before checking these moves, let's check some lesser moves. For example, the move g6, intending bishop g7, but the point with this, the bishop is not going to be very active on the long diagonal after white's move c3. So bishop g7 and now knight f3. So white simply develops normally, and this tension in the center is fine for white to keep, as black now already cannot easily go for the endgame, because the endgame is quite pleasant for white. Let's say d takes e4. If black doesn't take, white simply develops knight d2, let's say bishop e2, short castle. At some point e5, d4 can happen, and black will end up with a bad bishop. So the endgame in this case, d4, d4, queen d1, king d1, knight f6, knight b2, is really pleasant for white, as the bishop on g7 is quite passive, and the bishop on c8 also doesn't have great prospects. Best black can do is to give it up for a knight and give white the bishop pair. So for example, here already short castle, knight e1 is a very good move, intending moves like f3, knight d3, king c2, a4, a5. Very easy play on the queen side for white. Black suffers for lack of space and not being able to find good squares for the pieces. So that's the move g6. e6 is another option, but at least we have the moral victory of the Caro-Kann player having to shut his own bishop on c8. Knight f3, continuing development. Now, for example, knight f6, after e5, knight d7, c3, preparing d4, let's say c5, a3, controlling b4 and then d4. We have some sort of a advanced French, but one where the Caro-Kann player can't be too happy with that bishop stuck on c8. So already white is better already here, even objectively. So knight e7 is an alternative, knight bd2, c5, and now c3. Knight bc6, and now a very interesting move in Lila style, h4. A very interesting move because it introduces these ideas of h5, h6, and white still keeps the option, for example, of transposing to some sort of a King's Indian attack by playing e5 and then g3, bishop g2, with the benefit of the bishop not being on c1 but rather on f4. So this is already some victory for white when it comes to the opening, and don't forget also that that bishop is still stuck on c8. So these two moves, e6 and g6, are not very critical. Queen b6 is critical, and that was played by my opponent in the game, and I checked it in those 20 minutes, attacking the pawn on b2, and now the game becomes pretty sharp and very interesting. Knight bd2 is the best move, sacrificing the pawn on b2. Now black should take the pawn, and should take it immediately, because taking on e4 first, d4, d4, queen b2, is less precise because it allows white access to the c4 square. So at some point, knight c4 may be an option for white. So that is why, for example, a sample line, knight f3, knight d7, bishop c7, cutting off the queen's return via the b6 square. Let's say e6, bishop e2, knight f6, short castle, and already ideas like knight c4 and knight d6, rook b1 are coming, and black is in trouble. So that is why black should take immediately on b2, and now knight f3. So this was the position I studied in my pre-game preparations in England, and now black again has a choice. G6 is not one of those because bishop e5 wins on the spot. So if black wants to play g6, he should start with the move knight d7. The other development with e6 is made by the move c4. So another strong move. So just as a general note, these positions are very unexplored, and what I'm giving you is just some lines that I have looked at, but obviously there is a wide scope for creativity, investigation, and this also makes it a very good surprise weapon, the line with bishop f4. So by all means, and you should explore this on your own, in addition to what I'm showing you right now. So c4, now let's say knight f6, bishop e2, bishop e7, castles, castles, e5, knight fd7, and now knight b3, intending a3, and then the queen will be almost trapped, so queen a3, and now d4. So already white has obvious compensation for the pawn, very smooth development. Black is lagging behind in development. There are also some ideas for an attack on the king side, so compensation for white in this position. Another option after knight f3 is queen a3, yeah, but then just bishop e2 or d4 immediately, yeah, and then castles and d4 with again compensation for the pawn thanks to the smooth development and space advantage in the center. Knight d7 is probably best, controlling d5 square and intending g6. So now d4, and now black should play g6. Now there are quite a few traps, and I mean one trap and a couple of not very good moves. The trap is d takes e4, and it's funny that after the game with my opponent, he said that he rejected d4 as he said based on general grounds, and I was so unhappy to hear that, and I was cursing my bad luck because he was just lucky. Yeah, he didn't see why this was not good and just was lucky not to play it on general grounds. And the trap here consists that after the move knight c4, and what happens is that black loses the queen, so attacks the queen b4. Now c3 is the key move, luring the queen to c3, queen c3 and bishop d2, and the queen is trapped. It's still not over yet, because after queen a1, queen e1, e takes f3, black has quite a bit of a material, rook, knight and 3 pawns for the queen, but is lagging back in development, and the rooks are far from entering the game. So after something like h4, let's say, intending some h5, h6 ideas when the knight moves and so forth, the game is pretty unclear, but white is somewhat better. So this would have been fun to play. In the game, my opponent played e5, and this is a nervy move which is not very good, and I did obtain an advantage. Rook b1, queen c3, rook b3, queen a5, and now knight takes e5. The good thing is that white regains the pawn and now has an advantage in a position where he doesn't have a material deficit. So knight f6, knight d7, bishop d7, knight d7, e d5, followed by rook e3 just wins for white. So knight, bishop d7, and now e5. Knight e4, bishop d3, bishop b4, bishop e4, d4, castles, bishop e6, and up to here everything was more or less forced. And this is where I played the very interesting move c3, but it wasn't sufficient to obtain an advantage, and the game against Ian Gurley finished in a draw, played at the 4NCL league. My initial idea was actually the correct one, but I missed something. So I wanted to play knight e4, bishop takes b3, a takes b3, but I was discouraged because of this move queen d5. Otherwise, it's just great for white. For example, long castle check, and winning the pawn on g7, and white is basically winning. Or short castle again, queen g4 with mating threats, bishop h6, knight f6, and so forth. So queen d5, this is what discouraged me. But in fact, after queen d3, what I missed was after long castle, putting pressure on the pawn on d4, white simply can go rook d1. And then c4 is coming, c4 is coming, and white has a tremendous position. So this was the best chance I had in the game, and unfortunately I missed. So, but this shows that the move e5 is not a very good one. Neither is e6, because black is just too passive. Bishop d3, d4, knight e4, check on b4, knight e d2, then followed by short castle, and white has a fantastic development. Black's pieces are kind of pretty off and still needs to castle, and the bishop on c8 is passive, and so this is great for white. So the best move is actually g6, and here quite a few options for white. E d5 is one, rook b1 is another, a4 is an interesting idea, yeah, to take away the a3 square from the queen, and the most natural one being bishop d3. So now black needs to be a bit careful, because the automatic bishop g7 after short castle is already problematic for black, because he cannot finish development. d4, knight e4, knight f6 appears pretty good, but there is knight d6, and this is already quite devastating. e d6, check, bishop d6, not allowing castling, and coming rook e1, and this is tremendous for white. fantastic compensation. So things are dangerous. This means that black doesn't have time for bishop g7, so e4 should be played, and after knight e4, knight gf6. Bishop g7 short castle would be a transposition. And now knight eg5. An alternative is to drop back to d2. Yeah. So bishop g7, castles, rook e1. So quite an unclear position. White is still a pawn down, but a very good development, and black is still rather passive. White can play positionally, advancing with c4 in the center, for example. There are ideas like h4, and another idea is the sacrifice on f7. So h6, and now knight takes f7. Rook f7, bishop g6, rook f8, rook b1, queen a2, and queen c1. That was the idea of rook b1, to be able to play queen c1, so the queen on b2 no longer can protect that square on c1, and targeting the pawn on h6 with a white is a clear piece down, but with an obvious compensation. So very interesting lines in this queen b6 line, and if you like this line, I urge you to take a better look at these. This is just basically an overview. So check them, and I'm sure you'll find quite a lot of interesting ideas here. Now for something completely different. D takes e4, D takes e4, take on d1, king d1. So this endgame, like I said, it's equal, but it's not dead. And as you will see, it's a bit easier to play with white. White's plan actually is very simple. A4, a5, and play on the queen side. So black's best here is to try to achieve the e5 push to get some space for his pieces. So he can do this in two ways. One is to start with f6, and the other one is to start with knight d7. So let's say f6, now a4. The point with e5, knight d7 is that white cannot keep the pawn on e5. Let's say knight f3, g5 is coming, and then g4, and white cannot keep the pawn on e5. So this unfortunately doesn't work. But a4, e5, bishop e3 is something like the start of the equal endgame. So let's say a5. Otherwise, white would play a5. So a5, f3, bishop e6, knight d2, knight d7, and bishop c4. So you will see that even those pieces will be exchanged, white still keeps some active ideas at his disposal. Let's say king f7, take on e6, king e6, knight c4. This is one of the ideas, putting a knight on c4, targeting that pawn on a5 and the b6 square. Bishop c5. Black would like to exchange bishops, but now bishop d2, targeting the a5 square. There is always something little bit to play with in this endgame for white. Bishop b4, insisting on the exchange, but c3 now. Bishop c5 and knight e2. This is another typical idea. The knight is coming to c1 and then either to b3 or to d3. And knight b6, exchanging the active knight. Take on b6, bishop b6, king c2, knight e7, and knight c1. And the knight is coming, either to b3 or to d3. Let's say rook d8, knight b3, rook d7, and now c4. Opening the bishop, renewing the attack on the pawn on a5, threatening c5, and you could see white is pressing with very little risk. So this is one sample line. Yeah. Another one, we can check the alternative, which is knight d7. Yeah. a4, we know we threaten a5, e5, and now not bishop e3, bishop c5, yeah, but bishop g3. So the bishop still remains in contact with that pawn on e5, keeping the knight on d7. So now if f6, then a5, and then the development is f3. Okay, the bishop can drop back to f2 or e1 depending on circumstances. The knight can come to d2, the other one to e2, c3, king c2, knight c4, knight d1, knight b3, knight d3. We already saw these ideas previously. So a5, knight d2, f6, f3, and now knight c5. In case of bishop c5, knight e2, we know the maneuver. Knight's coming to c1 and then to b3 or d3. The other one to c4, depending again on circumstances. After knight c5, another idea in the position for white is the move h4, with the idea to expand on the king side with h5 at some point, not necessarily immediately, but it's just an option. So bishop e6, bishop c4. White would like to exchange the light squared bishops because black's one is quite a good one, not limited by these pawns. So long castle, bishop e6, knight e6, c3, covering the d4 square, bishop c5, king c2, knight e7, and knight e2. We know the maneuver, knight c1, and then to d3 or to b3. And black played all these natural moves, and at first sight really doesn't look like he has problems. But let me just show you how in a few moves black can easily end up in trouble. So white's ideas are known, knight c1, coming to d3, b3, and another one to c4, and also h5 on the king side just to grab some space. So if black stops it and plays h5, knight c1, following the plan, bishop b6, getting away from an attack, but knight c4 now, attacking the bishop, bishop c7, bishop f2, and all of a sudden black is in trouble. Knight b6 is threatened, knight b3, and how does black defend that pawn? So natural moves, everything seems like normal, and all of a sudden black can end up in trouble. So these are just some of the ideas that this endgame is very rich with. So if you are okay playing this endgame and you don't mind exploring it, I think you'll find quite a few interesting ideas and quite a lot of rich play in these positions. And coupled with that willingness to play the endgame, the move bishop f4, it can be a really very good surprise weapon. It served me in my game, and bear in mind, being move 3, it should have a pretty strong effect on your opponents. So okay, we conclude the shocking of the Caro-Kann as early as move 3. Make sure you smash that subscribe button and leave your opinions in the comments. So thanks for watching. I hope the Caro-Kann is no longer an annoyance for you, and I'll see you soon in one of the next videos. Take care, everyone.